The Vietnam War is often remembered for its intense jungle combat, anti-war protests, and the political chaos it caused in the United States and around the world. But beneath the battles and politics, there is a darker story. It is the story of young American soldiers who vanished into the thick forests of Southeast Asia, never to be seen again. Some were listed as missing in action. Some were later found, lifeless, in unmarked graves. Others simply disappeared. The world never heard their voices again. In this section, we will explore how this horror began and what made the experience of being captured by the Vietcong one of the most terrifying fates a soldier could face. American involvement in Vietnam started to rise sharply in the early 1960s. At first, the United States sent military advisors to support the South Vietnamese government in its fight against communist forces in the north, led by Ho Chi Minh. But as the conflict grew, so did the American presence. By the mid-1960s, hundreds of thousands of U.S. troops were deployed across Vietnam, especially in dangerous rural areas where the Viet Cong operated. The Viet Cong, officially known as the National Liberation Front, were a guerrilla group that used the landscape to their advantage. They built tunnels, moved through thick forests, and struck quickly before vanishing into the jungle. Unlike regular armies, they did not wear uniforms. They were farmers by day, fighters by night. This made them hard to detect, and their tactics deadly. But the Viet Cong were not only interested in fighting and disappearing, they also wanted prisoners. Capturing an American soldier was more than a military victory. It was a tool for propaganda, intelligence, and in some cases, psychological warfare. Prisoners could be used to make statements against the war, spread fear among enemy forces, or gain bargaining power in negotiations. According to the U.S. Department of Defense, more than 2,500 American servicemen were listed as prisoners of war, or missing in action during the Vietnam War. While some were later found or returned, many never came home. Behind those numbers are individual stories of suffering, bravery, and tragedy. Captured soldiers were often ambushed during routine patrols or supply missions. These ambushes were sudden, violent, and chaotic. A quiet trail would erupt in explosions. Gunfire would rain down from hidden positions. In the confusion, some soldiers were killed. Others were dragged away, sometimes wounded, sometimes blindfolded, always outnumbered. The Viet Cong had no formal prison system like those found in other wars. There were no barbed wire fences, no prison barracks, no guards in towers. Instead, American captives were often taken to temporary jungle camps. These camps were hidden deep in the forest, camouflaged with leaves and dirt. Prisoners were tied up, kept in small pits or bamboo cages, and moved frequently to avoid detection. The terrain made rescue nearly impossible. The jungle was thick, humid, and full of danger. Helicopters could not land easily. Search teams struggled to find even basic trails. Conditions inside these jungle prisons were brutal. Prisoners were starved, beaten, and denied medical care. They were isolated from others and forced to survive in extreme heat, with insects biting at their skin and disease spreading through their wounds. According to historians at Texas Tech University's Vietnam Center and Archive, torture was not uncommon. Some captives were left hanging by their arms for hours. Others were marched barefoot for days through rivers and forests with no food or water. There were even reports of soldiers being forced to dig their own graves before execution. The psychological torture was just as bad. The Viet Cong would tell prisoners that the war was over, that their country had abandoned them, that their families had forgotten them. For a young man thousands of miles from home, with no contact, no news, and no hope, those lies could become more painful than any physical wound. Even more chilling was the fact that the Geneva Conventions, the rules that protect prisoners of war in conflicts between countries, did not apply here in practice. The Viet Cong were not a formal government, they were a guerrilla force. That meant there were no Red Cross visits, No medical inspections, no letters home. The soldiers were completely alone, lost in the jungle, with no guarantee they would ever be found. One of the darkest aspects of this chapter in history is how many of these events remained hidden from the public for years. The US government was often reluctant to share the full details of what happened to captured soldiers. Part of this was because they had limited information. Part of it was because the truth was simply too painful. Telling the families that their sons had been tortured and executed in the jungle was something few officials wanted to do. Despite this silence, some stories did emerge. Not all soldiers remained prisoners forever. A few managed to escape. One well-known case is that of Lieutenant Nick Rowe. He was captured in the Mekong Delta in the year 1963 and held for 5 years in various jungle camps. Through courage and timing, he eventually escaped during a patrol and was rescued by US forces. His experience became a powerful symbol of survival and resistance. He later helped design training programs to prepare American soldiers for capture and taught them how to resist under pressure. But Rowe was one of the lucky few. Most soldiers who were taken by the Vietcong never returned. Their names are still listed on the black granite walls of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. Behind each name is a life cut short, a family left without answers, and a story that was never told. For European viewers, this part of the Vietnam War may not be as familiar as the televised protests or the fall of Saigon, but it is a vital piece of the puzzle. It reminds us that war is not just about tanks and guns. It is also about human suffering, hidden far from the headlines, deep in the shadows of history. This is the beginning of that dark reality, the unseen war in the jungle, where survival was uncertain and cruelty often went unchecked. In the next section, we will look more closely at the specific methods used by the Vietcong, the reasons behind their treatment of prisoners, and how this impacted the course of the war. When we think about prisoners of war, we often imagine them being held until the end of the conflict and then returned home. In many wars, including the First and Second World Wars, prisoners were usually treated according to international law. They were given food, medical care, and the chance to contact their families. But in Vietnam, things were very different. The Vietcong did not treat American prisoners this way. They were not just holding these men as captives. They were turning them into tools for war. To understand why, we need to look at how the Vietcong thought and what they wanted to achieve. The Vietcong were fighting what they believed was a war for their country's freedom. They saw the Americans not just as soldiers, but as invaders. Many Vietcong fighters had lost family members to bombings or had grown up in villages destroyed by airstrikes. This built a strong sense of anger and revenge, so when they captured American troops, some of them wanted to punish them in the harshest way possible. But it was not only about revenge. The Vietcong also used American prisoners as a way to send messages. These messages were aimed at many different targets. First, they wanted to scare other American soldiers. Word would spread that being captured by the Vietcong meant torture, isolation, or death. This fear could lower morale and make troops hesitate in battle. Second, the Vietcong used prisoners to break the spirit of the United States military. They believed that if they could make American soldiers appear weak or hopeless, it would weaken support for the war back home. They forced prisoners to write letters to their families, saying they had been treated well, even when they had not. Others were made to speak on radio broadcasts, telling Americans to stop fighting. These recordings were sometimes played on North Vietnamese stations that reached American forces. One well-known case was that of Corporal James Thomas. After being captured, he was forced to pose in photographs holding signs with anti-war messages. To people at home, it looked like he had changed sides. But in truth, he had been threatened with death if he did not cooperate. The Vietcong never meant to let him live. He was killed soon after the photos were taken. These actions served a purpose. They allowed the Vietcong to gain control over the story being told. If a prisoner could be shown on camera or heard on the radio, it gave the impression that the Vietcong were winning. It created confusion among American families and soldiers. Was the war going well? Were soldiers giving up? This kind of psychological warfare was just as important as any gun or grenade. Another reason why the Vietcong treated prisoners so harshly was their lack of resources. Unlike the North Vietnamese army, which had official camps, the Vietcong were fighting in rural areas with limited supplies. They could not afford to feed or house prisoners for long periods. So they used what they had: simple cages made of bamboo, pits in the ground covered with sticks. These were not designed for comfort or long-term survival. They were temporary holding places, often leading to execution if the prisoners were not useful. In many cases, prisoners were kept alive only as long as they had value. If they gave information, helped with propaganda, or could be used in a trade, they might live a little longer, but once they were no longer useful, their lives were in danger. Some were killed and left in shallow graves. Others were tied to trees and shot, sometimes just hours before U.S. search teams got close. The fear of capture changed how American soldiers behaved. Many carried extra bullets, not just for fighting, but to take their own lives if it came to that. They had seen or heard what happened to captured soldiers. For some, death was a better option than falling into Vietcong hands. In his book, 5 Years to Freedom, Lieutenant Nick Rowe explained that when he was taken prisoner, he expected to be killed within days. He survived, but his fear was real and shared by many others. The United States military also had to change its tactics. Rescue missions were launched whenever a soldier was known to be captured. But the jungle made these missions almost impossible. Vietcong camps moved often. Prisoners were blindfolded and relocated through hidden tunnels or over long trails. By the time rescue teams arrived, the camps were already empty. The military also began creating training programs to help soldiers survive if captured. These programs taught them how to resist interrogation, how to stay mentally strong, and how to avoid giving away secrets. Back in the United States, the public response was mixed. Families of missing soldiers lived in pain for years, not knowing if their loved ones were dead or still alive. Some held on to hope, while others demanded answers from the government. In the 1970s, groups like the National League of Families pushed for more information about prisoners and missing servicemen. They asked for better tracking, more aggressive rescue efforts, and official recognition of the soldiers who were never found. The U.S. government faced a difficult choice. Sharing too much information could hurt morale or reveal military weaknesses, but saying nothing left families in the dark. For years, details about how prisoners were treated were kept secret or only shared in private reports. It was not until decades later that some of the truth began to come out through books, interviews, and declassified documents. One of the most disturbing discoveries came from soldiers who managed to escape or were released in prisoner exchanges. They described in detail how the Vietcong broke bones, starved captives, and sometimes killed them as examples to others. These survivors became key sources of information. Their stories helped military leaders understand what was really happening in the jungle and how serious the problem was. This cruelty also influenced how the war was remembered. For many Americans, the idea of soldiers being tortured and forgotten created deep anger and sadness. It became one of the reasons why the war remained such a painful part of U.S. history. Even after the war ended, the question of missing soldiers remained open. Some believed there were still captives in Southeast Asia, long after the fighting had stopped. The Vietcong's use of prisoners as weapons, both physical and psychological, shows how complex and dark this conflict truly was. It was not just a war of bombs and bullets, but of fear, propaganda, and suffering. American soldiers had to fight not only the enemy, but also the possibility of being used as tools in a war they barely understood. The next section will focus on some of the most haunting stories of captivity, survival, and execution, true accounts that reveal how deep this darkness really went. For many American soldiers who were captured during the Vietnam War, the jungle was not just a battlefield. It became a prison, a torture chamber, and sometimes a grave. But even in the darkest places, there were stories of courage. Some fought to survive every day. Others resisted their captors in quiet but powerful ways. And a few found a way to escape, risking everything for a chance at freedom. In this section, we look at these human stories, not as statistics, but as moments of deep struggle, sacrifice, and sometimes hope. One of the most well-known stories of survival is that of a Lieutenant Nick Rowe. He was captured in the year 1963, early in the war, during a mission in the Mekong Delta. Rowe was a young officer serving with a South Vietnamese unit when his team was ambushed by Vietcong fighters. Most of the local soldiers were killed. Rowe and 2 other Americans were taken prisoner. For nearly 5 years, Rowe was held in small jungle camps. He was kept in a bamboo cage, often isolated from others, and forced to live in the dirt, surrounded by bugs, rats, and disease. His captors tried to break his spirit. They told him lies, that America had lost the war, that his family had forgotten him, that there was no hope of rescue. But Rowe resisted. He created a false identity, pretending to be an engineer instead of an intelligence officer. He refused to share secrets, and even though he was beaten and starved, he waited patiently for a chance to escape. That chance finally came in the year 1968. During a movement between camps, a U.S. helicopter flew over the area. In the confusion, Rowe struck one of his guards and ran into the jungle. Hours later, he was found by American forces and rescued. His survival was rare, and his experience became a key part of how the U.S. trained its soldiers for captivity. But not every story had a happy ending. Captain Rocky Versace was captured in the same ambush as Nick Rowe. He was known for being strong-willed and proud. Even while injured, Versace resisted his captors. He tried to escape more than once. He refused to cooperate with propaganda. Because of this, the Vietcong separated him from the other prisoners and treated him more harshly. After 2 years in captivity, he was executed. His body was never recovered. Decades later, he was awarded the Medal of Honor for his bravery and resistance under pressure. Another story is that of Sergeant Dan Pitzer, who was also captured in that same ambush. Unlike Versace, Pitzer survived. He spent 4 years in jungle camps, suffering from disease, malnutrition, and isolation. At one point, he weighed less than 100 pounds. He developed malaria, lost most of his teeth, and came close to death many times. But somehow, he endured. In the year 1967, he was released in a prisoner exchange. After returning home, he spoke openly about his time in captivity and worked to support other veterans. Some prisoners escaped not through running, but through survival itself. Corporal Alan Griggs was one of those few. Captured during a routine patrol in the year 1967, he spent months in jungle camps. The Vietcong kept him moving from one location to another. He was blindfolded, starved, and forced to march for days without rest. But one night, while guards were distracted, Griggs slipped away. He hid in the jungle for 2 days before being found by U.S. forces. When debriefed, he explained how prisoners were constantly moved, and that if the Viet Cong believed American forces were nearby, they would execute captives rather than risk a rescue. Sadly, many were not so fortunate. One of the most haunting stories comes from a reconnaissance mission in the Iron Triangle, a heavily guarded area northwest of Saigon. In the year 1968, a 5-man American team entered the area to gather intelligence. After they moved in, all communication was lost. No one heard from them again. Weeks later, their bodies were found in a hidden camp deep in the jungle. The signs of what had happened were disturbing. Their hands were tied, their uniforms were gone. Their dog tags were collected and placed on a small altar. It appeared that the Vietcong had executed them one by one, over a period of weeks, using them as symbols of defiance. These were not isolated events. Throughout the war, stories emerged of soldiers who were used in propaganda, then quietly executed. In some cases, villagers spoke of white soldiers seen marching barefoot through jungles. But by the time help arrived, the camps had been burned and the prisoners were gone. The jungle left little behind. Only scraps of clothing, broken gear, or sometimes a shallow grave. In the later years of the war, especially near the Cambodian border, American forces carried out secret missions deep into enemy territory. These soldiers, often part of special forces units, wore no official uniforms and operated without formal backup. If captured, their identities were not always recorded. In one such mission, in the year 1972, a 6-man team was sent into Cambodia to disrupt enemy supply lines. Only 2 returned. The others were found months later, buried in a remote part of the jungle. Their hands were still tied and their blindfolds still in place. The mission had been classified, and for years their names were not even listed among the war dead. These stories show us that captivity in Vietnam was not just a matter of being held. It was a constant fight for life, identity, and dignity. American soldiers faced not only physical torture, but also emotional isolation. Many of them died alone, far from home, with no way to tell their stories. And even today, more than 1,000 American service members from the Vietnam War are still listed as missing. For families back home, the pain never ended. Mothers and fathers waited for letters that never came. Wives raised children alone, holding on to fading photographs. Some received official notices. Others received silence. The mystery of what happened in those jungles still hangs heavy, decades later. But there is another side to these stories. One of honor, the courage shown by men like Nick Rowe, Rocky Versace, and Alan Griggs reminds us of the strength of the human spirit. Even in the worst conditions, they fought back, held on to their beliefs, and refused to give up. Their stories are more than tales of war. They are lessons in bravery, resilience, and sacrifice. As we remember the Vietnam War, especially from a European perspective, where it may seem distant or complex, it is important to focus on the human cost. These were not just soldiers. They were sons, brothers, friends. They were young men sent into a war far from their homes. Some returned. Many did not. And their stories deserve to be told, not just in history books, but in voices that can be heard, understood, and remembered.